The old farmhouse stood in the middle of nowhere, a place John Taylor, former sheriff, had chosen to escape to after retiring from the force. The house, weathered by time, groaned under the weight of the relentless storm outside. The rain lashed against the tin roof, the sound filling the silence inside. It was a peaceful night, yet peace felt foreign to John. At 57, John had been accustomed to the chaos of his former life, the radio crackling with calls, the sirens blaring, the constant demands. Now, in his retirement, there was nothing. Nothing but the occasional hum of the refrigerator, the tick-tock of an old clock, and the sound of the wind rushing through the trees outside. He sat in his recliner, staring at the television screen, but not really seeing it. The shows had lost their appeal, and the house felt too big for one person. His wife, Ellie, had passed away 2 years ago, and he had no children to visit him. The house was a relic of the past, the memories of his family and career lingering like ghosts. John had hoped that moving out here would give him peace, but all it gave him was a gnawing emptiness. He took another sip of his coffee, feeling the bitterness of both the drink and the reality that his life had come to this. As he sat there, his thoughts drifting, the quiet of the night was interrupted. A faint sound pierced through the wind, something that didn't belong. It was a soft, low whimper, almost lost amidst the storm. John paused, his tired eyes narrowing. Was it the wind? The house groaned again. No, this was something else. John rose slowly from the recliner, the bones in his joints protesting the movement. He set his mug down on the table and walked to the window, peering out into the dark yard. The storm made it impossible to see anything clearly, but the faintest of shapes appeared in the far distance. The shed. The whimpering came again, louder this time. A shiver ran down John's spine as he realized the noise was coming from the shed, his old tool. Shed barely used since he moved here. The sound, so foreign in this otherwise quiet night, made his pulse quicken. Someone was out there. He grabbed his jacket from the coat rack, pulled it on, and stepped into the cold, uninviting night. The rain hit his face like needles, and he squinted against the downpour as he made his way toward the shed. His boots sloshed through the mud, the familiar, comforting weight of his firearm still at his side, a habit from years of service. As he reached the shed, the whimpering intensified. It was definitely coming from inside. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as the wind pressed against it. John hesitated. He had been a sheriff for over 30 years, but something about this situation set his nerves on edge. Still, he had faced danger before. A situation like this, though? It was something he had never encountered. A soft, barely audible whimper. Not quite a cry, not quite a bark. With a deep breath, John pushed the door open. The inside of the shed was dark, the only light coming from the flickering bulb above. It wasn't much, but it was enough for John to see the figure in the corner. His heart sank. There, chained to the wall, was a dog, a German shepherd, its ribs visible beneath its matted fur. The dog's eyes were wide with fear, and its body trembled from the cold and neglect. The chain around its neck was rusted, digging into the flesh, its leg visibly injured. The dog looked like it hadn't seen a human in a long time, its body thin and fragile, its energy barely enough to make a sound. John's breath caught in his throat. "Hey, buddy," he muttered softly, stepping closer. The dog didn't move at first, just stared at him with wide, cautious eyes. John's years of law enforcement had taught him a lot, but this wasn't a criminal. This was a victim, a helpless one, a life that had been abandoned. He crouched slowly, careful not to make any sudden moves. "It's all right, I'm not gonna hurt you," he whispered, his voice low and steady. The dog let out another whimper, but this time it wasn't out of fear. It was something softer, more like a plea. John reached out cautiously, his hand trembling slightly. The dog didn't back away. Instead, it seemed to inch closer, allowing John to touch its muzzle. There was a moment of silence between them, the storm still raging outside, but for John, it felt like time had stopped. He ran his hand gently over the dog's fur, feeling the bony frame beneath it. His mind raced. Who would do this to a dog, to any living creature? And why had it been left here, chained and forgotten? Without thinking, John stood up and began searching for the shed's rusty toolbox. There was a saw inside, something he could use to cut through the chain. His mind worked quickly, calculating the best way to get the dog out of the mess it was in. With a few strokes, the chain fell to the ground. The dog let out a small sigh, still too weak to move but free from its torment. John gently lifted the dog into his arms, feeling its frail body against his chest. It was light, but not in the way it should have been. He carried the dog inside, his heart heavy with the weight of this unexpected responsibility. The dog was too weak to protest as John set it down on an old blanket by the fireplace. He went to the kitchen, prepared a bowl of water and some scraps of meat he had left. The dog seemed to sense the care in John's actions, but it was still scared, still broken. John sat across from the dog, watching it with quiet concern. He didn't know what he was doing, but something told him he couldn't just leave it. The dog needed help, it needed him. Max, as John had decided to name the dog, didn't touch the food right away. His eyes flickered toward John every so often, distrust still evident in the animal's gaze. John, not wanting to pressure Max, simply sat in silence. The storm outside began to quiet down, and in the stillness, the two of them shared a moment of peace, a moment of quiet understanding. Days passed, each one blending into the next. John had never been good at staying still, but for Max, he was learning to slow down. The dog had started eating regularly, and though weak, his once vibrant coat began to show signs of life again. John was diligent in his care, fresh food, water, and bandages for the wounds on Max's leg. But healing wasn't just physical. The dog was still skittish, afraid of sudden movements, of loud noises. The storm had passed, but the storm inside Max had not. John would sit quietly next to Max as he ate, offering his presence and his comfort. He spoke to Max in the same soothing tone, whether or not the dog understood. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" John said one evening, scratching the dog behind his ears. Max tilted his head, his ears twitching, but he didn't move away. It was progress. John couldn't help but compare himself to the dog. Like Max, he had been left behind by life. He had retired from a life that once gave him meaning, just as Max had been discarded when his usefulness had run out. Both of them were survivors grappling with pain, loneliness, and the desire to belong somewhere, to someone. John's eyes softened as he watched Max. "We'll figure this out together, boy." A week later, John decided to take Max to the local veterinarian. He hadn't been to town in days, but he figured it was time to get the dog a proper examination. The vet was a middle-aged woman named Dr. Emily Hayes. John had known her years ago when he was still sheriff. She was compassionate and always willing to help whenever there was a need. When they arrived at the clinic, Max was understandably nervous. He tried to hide behind John's legs, but John coaxed him forward, speaking gently as they entered the small waiting room. "Come on, Max. It's okay," Dr. Hayes greeted them warmly. "Well, well, John Taylor. Didn't think I'd see you out here unless it was for an emergency." John chuckled. "I suppose this counts as one." He gestured to Max. "Found him out by the shed. I think he's had a pretty rough time of it." Dr. Hayes leaned down to examine Max. "I can see that. He's malnourished, and this injury..." She frowned, carefully examining the chain marks on Max's leg. "It's bad, but it's not the worst I've seen. He'll need some stitches and antibiotics. And we'll have to keep an eye on him for infection." John nodded. "I'll do whatever it takes." As Dr. Hayes worked on Max, she explained that the dog was once a service animal, likely from a private security firm. She suspected Max had been discarded after he was injured, something all too common with retired working dogs. They work hard, but when they can't do the job anymore, they're left behind. It's a shame. You see it more often than you'd like. John felt a pang of guilt. He knew the kind of heartlessness she was talking about. His own career had been full of good men and women who had sometimes been thrown away once they were no longer deemed useful. He'd always been someone who believed in second chances. He just hadn't realized how much he needed one himself. When the examination was over, Dr. Hayes gave John a prescription for pain relief and some food to help. Max gained strength. She gave him some advice, but mostly She just nodded in approval as John carefully bundled the dog back into the truck. "I think you'll be good for him, John," she said, watching them leave. Weeks passed, and Max began to change. He was still cautious, but the quiet companionship between him and John grew. John began to take him on short walks around the property, teaching him simple commands: sit, stay, heel. Max was intelligent, despite his initial fear, and quickly began responding. John's sense of purpose returned. For the first time in months, he had a routine, taking care of Max, making sure he ate, and giving him the attention he deserved. Max, in turn, began to trust John more each day. He would sit quietly by John's feet as the sheriff worked in his shed or around the house, content with just being near him. John often found himself talking to Max, telling him about his past, the things he missed from his career, his late wife Ellie, and the loneliness he'd felt since retirement. Max didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone, the emotion in John's voice. It was a way for John to release the pent-up feelings he had no one else to share them with. And slowly, Max responded, offering comfort simply by being present. One night, after a particularly long day of yard work, John sat on the porch, the warm summer evening wrapping around him. Max lay beside him, resting his head on John's boots. For a moment, it felt like things were right again, like the old days of serving and protecting, except this time, he was protecting something else. "Maybe this is what I needed," John said, stroking Max's head. A chance to take care of something again. Max, now fully healed, raised his head and licked John's hand. It was a simple gesture, but to John, it meant everything. John's life was starting to feel whole again, but it would take an unexpected event to show him just how much his bond with Max had grown. One night, as he and Max slept on the couch in the living room, a loud noise startled them both. John's eyes snapped open. The floorboards creaked under the weight of someone moving through the house. The storm outside had died down, and all was eerily still. Then he heard it again, the unmistakable sound of a door opening. His instincts kicked in. John reached for his gun, but before he could even fully rise, Max was on his feet, alert and growling. The dog's eyes were wide, scanning the darkness. "Easy, boy," John whispered. But Max wasn't listening. With a low growl, he moved toward the door where he'd heard the noise. John followed, quietly pulling the gun from its holster. He heard the faint shuffle of footsteps moving down the hallway. Max was already ahead of him, ears flat against his head, teeth bared. He lunged at the intruder, the attacker's shout echoing through the house. The fight was brief. Max's strength and agility caught the burglar off guard, knocking him to the ground. John, though injured in the struggle, was able to grab his phone and call for help. The second intruder, realizing their partner was incapacitated, bolted. By the time the sheriff's department arrived, the first burglar was handcuffed, and Max had successfully defended John. The next few weeks brought changes. John had never considered what Max was capable of, but after the break-in, he began to understand. Max was more than just a companion. He was a protector, a partner. John decided to create something more for dogs like Max retired K9s and abandoned service dogs. With help from old colleagues and a grant from a veterans organization, John founded Max's Sanctuary, a program dedicated to rescuing and retraining retired and abandoned service dogs. The program became a place of healing for both the dogs and the veterans, first responders, and people in need of companionship. John had found his new purpose, and Max, the dog he had rescued, was now helping others just as he had helped John. It had been a few months since Max's Sanctuary had opened, and John could see the changes in the dogs and the people who came to help. The Sanctuary had become a place of healing, a safe space for both the retired K9 dogs and the veterans, first responders, and families who had come to volunteer or adopt. John was there every day, working alongside the dogs, cleaning the kennels, overseeing training sessions, and making sure the animals were well cared for. But it wasn't just the dogs that were healing. The veterans, many of whom had suffered from PTSD or trauma, found solace in caring for the dogs, building relationships just like John had with Max. One morning, as John was walking the grounds of the sanctuary, Max trotted alongside him, tail wagging. They had both become a symbol of resilience, John, the man who had found new purpose in his later years, and Max, the dog who had come back from the brink of death to become a protector and a loyal companion. John smiled as Max nudged, his hand looking up at him with those intelligent eyes. The dog had become more than just a companion. He was his partner, his friend, and his reminder that it was never too late to start over. As John walked through the sanctuary, he saw veterans working with dogs, children laughing as they played with the animals, and families finding comfort and companionship. The program was growing, and John felt a deep sense of pride. But it was more than just the work, it was the connection, the relationships that were being built here between people and dogs, between the past and the future. John had found something he never thought he'd find again, a sense of home, of belonging. One afternoon, as John was sitting on the porch of his farmhouse with Max by his side, a familiar car pulled into the gravel driveway. John squinted, recognizing the vehicle immediately. It was Dr. Emily Hayes, the vet who had treated Max all those months ago. She stepped out of her car, a warm smile on her face as she walked toward the porch. "Didn't expect to see you out here," John said, standing to greet her. "What brings you by?" Dr. Hayes chuckled softly, her eyes scanning the expansive grounds of the sanctuary. "I've been meaning to come by and check on how you're doing. I see you've been keeping busy." John nodded. "Couldn't have done it without Max," he said, giving the dog a pat on the head. Max, who had been lounging at John's feet, raised his head at the sound of his name, then wagged his tail in recognition. It was a far cry from the fearful dog John had first discovered in the shed. The transformation was remarkable. "I'm proud of you, John," Dr. Hayes said, sitting down beside him. "This place is incredible. You've really made something special here. I always knew you had a good heart." John looked out at the sanctuary, the dogs running around, the volunteers helping. He was quiet for a moment before he spoke again. "It's strange, Emily. I used to think I was done, that my best days were behind me. I had nothing left to give, but Max, he changed that. We saved each other. I didn't think I'd ever feel needed again. And now here we are, building something bigger than either of us." Emily smiled, her eyes twinkling. "You gave Max a second chance, and in return, he gave you yours." John chuckled softly, looking down at Max, who was resting his head on John's boots. "I never expected this," John said. "But I guess that's the way life works. It doesn't go the way we think it will, but that doesn't mean it's not worth living." As the seasons changed, so did the sanctuary. More dogs were rescued and more lives were touched. John found fulfillment, not just in the work itself, but in the way the sanctuary brought people together. It became a community, one where individuals came to heal, to share, and to grow. One day, as John stood at the entrance of the sanctuary, watching the dogs play and the people laugh, he felt a deep sense of peace. He had given everything to his career, and he had lost so much along the way. But the sanctuary, Max, and the community they had built was the gift he never thought he would receive. Max walked up to him, his tail wagging, and nuzzled against his leg. John bent down, stroking the dog's fur. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. "Guess we did all right, didn't we?" John whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Max's eyes sparkled in the sunlight, and for a moment, they just stood there together. The weight of the years was still there, but it didn't feel so heavy anymore. John had found a new purpose, a new family, and with Max by his side, he felt like he was home. It was a peaceful evening as John sat on the front porch of his farmhouse once again, the stars shining above. Max lay at his feet, content in the stillness. The wind whispered through the trees and the world felt quiet, calm. For the first time in a long while, John felt like he belonged. The emptiness that had once consumed him seemed to have faded away. There was no more ache of isolation, no more longing for a past that could never be reclaimed. Instead, he had built something new, something that filled his heart in ways he had never imagined. Max, now strong and healthy, lifted his head and looked up at John, as if sensing the weight of the moment. Their eyes met, and in that silent exchange they understood. They had both been lost, both needed a second chance, and together they had found it. John smiled, resting his hand on Max's head. "We did all right, didn't we, buddy?" Max let out a soft sigh as if in agreement and laid his head back down. The evening stretched on, and for John, the future no longer felt uncertain. There was a new sense of hope, a new beginning not just for him, but for all the dogs and people who would come to Max's sanctuary in the years to come. And as the stars twinkled above, John and Max sat together in quiet contentment, knowing that the best part of their journey was still unfolding. The story of John and Max, two beings who had been broken and abandoned, came full circle. Through their mutual rescue and the healing they offered each other, they discovered the true meaning of second chances. And in doing so, they built something beautiful, a sanctuary for those who had nowhere else to go, a place where dogs and people alike could find hope, companionship, and purpose once again.